George Kingston was the archetypal success story. In his early 40s, he had established a remarkable career as a real estate broker specializing in premium properties for the city's elite. Known for his sharp negotiating skills and forward-thinking approach, George had built a clientele that was both esteemed and faithful. He owned several upscale condos downtown, which were both evidence of his diligence and symbols of his status in the community. George lived a life many desired. His home, a vast estate in a high-end suburban neighborhood, was a marvel of architecture and design, featuring exquisitely landscaped gardens and an interior that merged classic style with contemporary comforts. This residence was more than just a dwelling, it was a retreat he shared with his wife, Natalie. Natalie Kingston was everything one could wish for in a partner: attractive, smart, and successful as a marketing director at a leading firm. Renowned for her tactical acumen and her knack for enchanting clients with ease, Natalie and George formed a dynamic duo often spotted at charity galas and local gatherings, radiating a sense of sophistication and achievement that many admired. On the surface, their life seemed perfect. They enjoyed weekends in the Hamptons, social gatherings with influential friends, and impromptu trips to Paris or Rome. Their home buzzed with joy and the anticipation of a future as luminous as their present. To their neighbors and friends, they personified joy and affluence. Yet, beneath the glossy exterior, George started noticing subtle shifts in Natalie in the months prior to a significant event. There were indications that something was amiss, initially easy to ignore. Natalie, who had always been occupied, was now often at the office late and away on longer business trips. George would occasionally catch Natalie absorbed in her phone, her expression concentrated as she typed swiftly. When he inquired, she would dismiss it as job-related pressure, mentioning a few critical projects with a comforting smile, though her eyes didn't quite meet his. Other changes were apparent too. Natalie, once lively and vibrant, now seemed detached, her thoughts elsewhere even when they were together. Her laughter, once heartfelt and spontaneous, now appeared contrived, and their discussions, previously natural and fluid, now seemed forced and uncomfortable. George tried to overlook his growing anxiety, attributing it to the demands of Natalie's intense career, especially since she had recently been promoted, increasing her duties. Despite his attempts to justify her actions, a persistent feeling of doubt remained, a hint of skepticism that he couldn't shake off. Despite the turmoil at home, George's daily routine stayed mostly consistent. His days were packed with appointments, property viewings, and deal-making. He reveled in the thrill of sealing deals, the gratification of connecting clients with their ideal homes, and the daily challenges. George was thorough in his profession, always aiming for perfection. He took pride in his ability to predict market trends and tailor his tactics accordingly. His clients relied on him deeply, assured that he would always exceed their expectations. Yet, despite his professional triumphs, George's real happiness stemmed from his life with Natalie. Despite his hectic schedule, he consistently made time for her, leaving work early to prepare her preferred dishes, surprising her with candlelit dinners and her favored wine on weekends. He planned romantic escapes to reignite the flame in their relationship, striving to reclaim the enchantment they once experienced. In those tranquil moments at home, away from the demands of their busy careers, George treasured the simple joys of life with Natalie, whether it was watching films together, strolling hand in hand through their area, or just sitting in peaceful silence. He cherished the moments they shared together, despite the widening gap between them. George maintained his belief that their love was strong enough to endure any hardship. He was committed to supporting Natalie, helping her tackle any obstacles she encountered, just as she had supported him throughout his career. He chose not to let doubt cloud his trust in her, focusing instead on the life they had built and the future they still planned to create. However, as time passed, George found it increasingly difficult to ignore his growing unease. He began to notice subtle hints that fueled his suspicions: Natalie's newfound hesitancy to talk about her day, her avoidance of his gaze when he inquired about her late nights, and the unexplained appearance of new clothes and jewelry. George's instincts, sharpened by years of reading clients and closing deals, signaled that something was amiss, yet he hesitated to confront Natalie, fearing it might irreparably harm their relationship. Instead, he chose to give her the benefit of the doubt, hoping his suspicions were baseless and that Natalie was still the woman he believed her to be. Despite clinging to this hope, George couldn't dismiss the feeling that his ideal life was unraveling. The signs of trouble were too numerous to overlook, and the growing chasm between him and Natalie seemed ready to consume everything he cherished. In the quiet that often precedes a storm, George found himself reflecting on their life together, the joys, the challenges they had surmounted, and the dreams they had yet to realize. He yearned to reclaim the magic that had once defined their relationship and to rediscover the happiness they had once shared. It was on a Saturday morning that George Kingston decided to tackle the long-neglected leaky pipe in the basement, a chore he had put off for weeks. Natalie had mentioned she would be at a marketing conference for the weekend. The house felt eerily silent without her, and George welcomed the solitude as a chance to concentrate on the overdue home maintenance. He collected his tools and headed to the basement, a dimly lit area that smelled faintly of damp concrete and old paint. The basement served as a storage space, cluttered with boxes of seasonal decorations, old furniture, and forgotten mementos of their life together. As he descended the creaky wooden steps, the sound of dripping water intensified, reminding him of his task. George set about his work, kneeling on the cold floor as he inspected the faulty pipe. He relished the simplicity of the task. There was a clear problem and a straightforward solution, unlike the complexities he sensed in his personal life. For a moment he lost himself in the rhythmic process of tightening bolts and sealing joints, finding a semblance of peace in the task. As George worked, he heard voices drifting down from the floor above. Initially, he assumed Natalie had left the television on before she left. He continued his work, the voices a distant murmur in the background. But as the conversation grew clearer, he paused, realizing one of the voices was Natalie's. His heart skipped a beat as he strained to listen. Natalie's voice was playful, her laughter light and intimate, so different from the strained tone he had grown used to in recent months. But it was the other voice, a man's voice, that stirred a surge of unease within him. The voice was unfamiliar, deep, and self-assured. "Don't worry, sweetie," the man said, his voice carrying a confident drawl that grated on George's nerves. "While you're at work, I'll take care of everything. The house will burn down with your cucked husband inside, and you'll get the insurance money. Then we can sell everything off." George's breath hitched, the wrench slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor as the full impact of the words struck him. His mind raced, his heart pounding as if trying to escape the horror unfolding around him. Natalie's reply was like a dagger twisting in his gut. "No one will suspect us," she responded, her voice edged with a smile. "I can't wait for it to happen." For a moment, George felt as though he was floating outside his own body, detached from reality. The basement, once a place of routine chores and quiet reflection, now felt like a prison, suffocating and oppressive. His mind reeled, struggling to grasp the betrayal, the cold, calculated plan spoken so nonchalantly above him. The woman he had loved and trusted, the woman with whom he had shared his life, was plotting with another man to end his life. The realization hit him like a tidal wave of pain and fury, threatening to overwhelm him. His thoughts whirled chaotically. Natalie's recent behavior, the late nights, the distant glances, all snapped into grim focus with nauseating clarity. Yet, beneath the shock and hurt, a fierce determination began to form. George was not a man to accept defeat easily. His success in the real estate sector had been built on resilience and adaptability, traits that would now serve him well in this personal crisis. He knew he needed to act swiftly and meticulously. The shock of the betrayal would have to be shelved. Survival was his immediate focus. Natalie and her accomplice had underestimated him, dismissing him as a mere hindrance to their plans. But George was resolved to prove them wrong, to turn their own scheme against them. He picked up the wrench, gripping it firmly as he heard the footsteps above fade away. The casual manner in which they had plotted his demise steeled his resolve. He wouldn't let them take everything from him without a fight. Emerging from the basement, George moved stealthily through the house, his senses sharp and vigilant. He had to think, to strategize his next moves with precision. He couldn't afford any missteps, not with his life at stake. George knew he needed solid evidence, something tangible that would unveil Natalie and her lover's plans. He required proof, something undeniable that would reverse the roles and shield him from their deceit. His mind raced through the options, evaluating the risks and potential outcomes. George decided to leave the house temporarily, pretending to go to a business meeting. He wanted Natalie to think that nothing had altered, that he was blissfully ignorant of her betrayal. In reality, he planned to remain nearby, observing and waiting for the perfect opportunity to act. Over the following days, George maintained the facade of normalcy, pretending to be the same unsuspecting husband he had always been. Natalie returned from her alleged conference, her demeanor still confident, oblivious to the fact that George was a step ahead. As he gathered more evidence, his resolve crystallized into a plan. He was determined not only to survive but also to ensure that Natalie and her lover faced consequences for their deceit. It was a perilous game, but George was prepared to risk everything to protect himself and seek justice. He continued to act as if nothing had changed, biding his time while he collected recordings and documents that would disclose the conspiracy. Every interaction with Natalie tested his resolve, each moment an opportunity to strengthen his plan. The agony of betrayal was ever present, a constant companion that he had to sideline to concentrate on his objectives. Yet George harnessed that anguish, using it as motivation for the determination that blazed within him. He knew confronting Natalie directly would be risky. He needed irrefutable proof and a flawless strategy to ensure his safety and secure justice. He knew the stakes were high, but he was ready to do whatever it took. George Kingston stood in the dim light of the basement, his heart racing as he overheard the ominous conversation between his wife Natalie and her lover Derek. Each word struck him like a blade, yet George forced himself to stay composed, aware that any small sound might reveal his presence. As the dialogue progressed, he quietly retrieved his phone and set it to record. The device captured their voices. Each incriminating phrase permanently recorded a crucial piece of evidence in what had now become a battle for his survival. His hands trembled slightly as he made sure the phone was perfectly positioned to clearly catch the conversation. Natalie's voice, though familiar, was now chillingly indifferent, filled with a casual cruelty he had never thought possible. Derek's voice, confident and commanding, resonated alongside hers, weaving a narrative of betrayal and avarice that sent shivers down George's spine. Once he was confident he had gathered enough evidence, George carefully stopped the recording and concealed the phone back in his pocket. With each step, he cautiously avoided the creaky floorboards, moving like a shadow as he left the basement. His mind was alert, yet his movements were deliberate, driven by a newfound clarity of purpose. He needed to act quickly, ensuring that Natalie and Derek remained oblivious to his awareness until the perfect moment. As soon as he exited the house, George drove to a nearby hotel, maintaining the pretense of a business trip. He checked in, feigning a late-night arrival, his demeanor calm despite the inner chaos. Once in the privacy of his hotel room, George allowed himself a moment to grasp the full weight of the situation. The betrayal was profound, but he knew that reacting in anger or desperation would only compromise his chances of coming out ahead. He had to be strategic, planning each step with careful precision. As he replayed the recording on his phone, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over him. The evidence was undeniable, a clear testament to the deceit and malevolence that had seeped into his life. George contemplated going to the police, but he swiftly dismissed the idea, knowing there was no assurance they would act quickly enough to prevent the planned arson, and he couldn't leave his fate in the hands of a system that might let him down. Moreover, a part of him desired justice on his own terms, a revenge that would ensure Natalie and Derek suffered for their deceit. With a resolved mindset, George began to outline a plan. He mapped out each step with meticulous attention, considering every possible scenario and contingency. He knew he had to outsmart Natalie and Derek at their own game. This was no longer merely about survival, it was about regaining control over his life. To execute his plan, George needed reliable allies. He reached out to an old friend, Jack Thompson, a private investigator known for his discretion and effectiveness. George and Jack had a history of collaboration, their friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. George detailed the situation and the evidence to Jack, who listened with a mix of shock and resolve. "I'll help you," Jack affirmed, his voice firm. "We'll make sure they get what's coming to them." Together, they started to devise a strategy that would lead Natalie and Derek to believe they were successfully executing their plan. George had to maintain the illusion of ignorance, pretending to be blissfully unaware of their scheme. It was a delicate balance, requiring patience and meticulous planning, but George was committed to seeing it through. Jack installed surveillance equipment in the house, cameras and microphones strategically placed to capture every movement and conversation. They coordinated their actions, ensuring every detail was meticulously accounted for. The trap was set, but George knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He continued to play his role, interacting with Natalie as if nothing had changed, all the while documenting their interactions and collecting additional evidence. It was a psychological struggle, one that tested his determination and endurance, but George remained unyielding, driven by a desire for justice and resolution. As the days went by, George found himself maneuvering through a web of deceit. Each encounter with Natalie reminded him of the betrayal that had fractured their lives. He observed her closely, noting every subtlety in her behavior, every hint of doubt or hesitation that might suggest she was aware of his suspicions. Natalie, for her part, appeared secure in her deception. She continued her usual routines, her demeanor constant, oblivious to the fact that George was always one step ahead. Her phone conversations with Derek were monitored, each call analyzed for clues or discrepancies. George and Jack worked tirelessly, assembling the pieces of the puzzle that would ultimately unveil the scheme. George found comfort in the accuracy of his plan, reassured by the control he was regaining over his life. He sharpened his instincts, drawing on his background in real estate negotiations where interpreting people and predicting their actions had been crucial to his success. In the quiet before the storm, George took a moment to reflect on the journey that had led him here. The betrayal had acted as a catalyst, a turning point that forced him to reassess his life and priorities. He had faced challenges he had never imagined, pushed to the edge of despair, yet he had come out stronger and more determined. Looking forward, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been granted a second chance, an opportunity to reshape the narrative of his life. The path would not be simple, but he was resolved to advance, to shape a future defined not by betrayal but by justice and renewal. With the trap set and the evidence secured, George and Jack made their final preparations. They reviewed their strategy, ensuring every detail was considered and every potential issue addressed. The confrontation was near, but George felt a sense of peace amid the turmoil, a conviction that justice would triumph. He steeled himself for the challenges ahead, knowing that the road to resolution would be fraught with danger and unpredictability, but he was prepared, strengthened by the assurance that he had done all within his power to safeguard himself and reclaim his life. As he readied to confront Natalie and Derek, George was determined not to rest until justice was achieved, until the truth was disclosed and the betrayal that had threatened to ruin him was finally resolved. George Kingston awoke on the day of his supposed business trip filled with both anticipation and apprehension. This was the day he had meticulously planned for, a carefully arranged departure that would set the stage for his ultimate retribution. After showering and getting dressed, he entered the bedroom where Natalie was already enjoying her morning coffee, her attention fixed on the screen of her phone. "Good morning," he greeted her with a feigned casualness that concealed the intensity simmering beneath the surface. "Good morning, honey," she responded, barely glancing up. "Big day today." George nodded, maintaining his guise. "I have to fly out for that major real estate deal I mentioned. It'll be a couple of days." Natalie offered him a distracted smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Good luck," she remarked, her voice neutral. George packed his bags slowly, ensuring Natalie observed every move as he placed his laptop, documents, and clothes into the suitcase. He checked his phone one last time, pretending to confirm his flight details, and then zipped up his bag with a definitive flourish. "Off I go," George announced, standing at the door with his luggage. He leaned in to give Natalie a kiss on the cheek, a gesture that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. She smiled back, possibly already mentally ticking off the first step of their sinister plan. "Safe travels," she said, watching him exit the door. George's heart pounded as he drove away from the house, every nerve on edge as he initiated the first part of his ruse. Instead of driving to the airport, he headed to a small, inconspicuous hotel on the outskirts of town where his private investigator, Jack Thompson, was waiting. From the hotel, George and Jack established their makeshift command center. They monitored the live feed from the surveillance equipment they had installed throughout the house. Cameras and microphones captured every part of the living room, kitchen, and even the bedrooms, ensuring that no area of the house was out of their sight. The tension in the hotel room was tangible as they watched the live feed. George's gaze was fixed on the screen where Natalie appeared in the kitchen, preparing a light lunch as if it were just another ordinary day. Soon after Derek arrived, his presence in George's home a stark reminder of the betrayal that had led them to this moment. Jack, skilled in surveillance, observed with professional detachment, but George felt each second as a profound affront. Derek and Natalie were at ease, exchanging playful banter and secret kisses as they made plans for the evening, completely oblivious that every word and glance was being recorded, their fate sealed by their own overconfidence. "I can't believe they're so assured," George muttered, his voice a blend of disbelief and anger. Jack nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "Arrogance is often their downfall," he responded. The hours passed slowly as they watched, each tick of the clock bringing them closer to the night's perilous climax. Natalie and Derek moved with a disconcerting calm, their actions methodical as they gathered the materials needed for the fire they planned to start. As night fell, casting shadows over the house that seemed to reflect the darkness of their intentions, George sat in the hotel room, tension coiled tightly within him. He knew that tonight would mark the culmination of everything he had worked towards, the point of no return. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, glancing at George. George nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. "Yeah, let's do this," he affirmed. They watched as Natalie and Derek moved through the house, setting the stage for their arson attempt. Natalie's manner was composed, her actions systematic as she placed accelerants in strategic spots, unaware that each move was being recorded with crystal-clear precision. Meanwhile, Derek fiddled with a lighter, his confidence in stark contrast to the dread building in George's chest. George and Jack had already alerted the authorities, coordinating with them to ensure they would arrive at the precise moment to catch Natalie and Derek in the act. The plan was straightforward: let them start their scheme and then intervene before any real damage could occur. As Derek prepared to ignite the accelerant, George knew it was time to act. With Jack at his side, they drove to the house, their hearts sinking with the roar of the engine. They pulled up to the driveway just as Derek flicked the lighter open, its flame dangerously close to the accelerant-soaked materials. George burst through the front door, his arrival like a thunderclap that broke the tense silence. "Stop," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Natalie's head whipped around, her face losing all color as she realized she had been caught. Derek froze, the lighter slipping from his hand as he stared at George, eyes wide with shock. "You really thought you could get away with this?" George continued, holding up his phone, the screen displaying the live feed from their surveillance setup. Every word, every plan recorded. Natalie's composure shattered, her eyes flicking between George and Derek, as if looking for a way out. "George, I don't—" she started to say, but George cut her off, his voice cold and firm. "You were going to kill me, Natalie. You and your accomplice here." Derek stepped forward, trying to form a defense, but the sound of sirens interrupted him. The police arrived, their lights flashing, bathing the house in red and blue. Officers filled the room, their actions precise and efficient. "George Kingston," one of the officers asked, approaching him. George nodded, handing over the phone with the recordings. "It's all here: attempted arson, conspiracy to commit murder." Natalie and Derek were handcuffed, their expressions ones of disbelief and despair, as they were led out of the house. George watched them leave, a complex mix of triumph and sorrow settling in his heart. The people he had once trusted had conspired to destroy him, but now they faced the consequences of their actions. As the police wrapped up their investigation, George remained in the living room, the reality of the night weighing on him. The house, once filled with memories of love and happiness, now felt foreign, its walls echoing with betrayal. Jack joined him, placing a supportive hand on his back. "You did it, George." "It's over." George nodded, his gaze distant as he processed the events of the night. He had weathered the storm, but the road ahead was unclear. The betrayal had left deep scars, wounds that would take time to heal. "Thanks, Jack," George said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jack smiled warmly, a gesture of camaraderie and support. "Any time, my friend. Now you can start rebuilding." George took a deep breath, feeling the burden of his decisions lift slightly. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. Standing in the house that had been both his sanctuary and his prison, he resolved to move forward, comforted by the knowledge that justice had been served. With one last look around the room, George stepped outside. The cool night air was soothing against the turmoil within. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was prepared to face it, strengthened by the resilience forged in the crucible of betrayal. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of disbelief as the verdict was read aloud. Natalie Kingston and Derek Harrington were found guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder and conspiracy to commit arson. The evidence against them was overwhelming, the recordings George had collected playing a pivotal role in exposing their scheme. Each playback of their cold, calculating voices sent shockwaves of shock through the courtroom, leaving no doubt about their intentions. George sat in the gallery, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion as the judge pronounced the sentence. Natalie and Derek were led away in handcuffs, their faces masks of disbelief and defeat. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy him was now fully exposed, its architects facing the consequences of their actions. The gavel's final bang echoed like closure, marking the end of a chapter filled with deceit and treachery. The community, once captivated by the illusion of a perfect marriage, rallied around George. Neighbors who had seen him leave for work each day and return each night now offered their support, shocked by the dark undercurrents that had been flowing beneath the surface. The betrayal was a rupture in the fabric of their small, close-knit society, but George's resilience shone through like a beacon. Friends and acquaintances approached him with words of admiration and encouragement, marveling at his strength and cunning, his ability to navigate the storm with a level head. The ordeal that could have shattered him instead became a testament to his tenacity. In the days that followed, George became somewhat of a local hero, a symbol of overcoming adversity. He was invited to community gatherings where people expressed their support and shared stories of how his ordeal had inspired them. Although he appreciated the recognition, George remained humble, acknowledging that the path to justice had been a collective effort. With the trial behind him, George turned his attention to the future. The insurance money, initially intended to be part of Natalie and Derek's nefarious plan, was now rightfully his. Additionally, the assets he and Natalie had shared were liquidated, providing him with a substantial financial cushion. Selling the house, once a symbol of their shared life, was a bittersweet decision. The walls that had seen moments of love and betrayal now seemed tainted, a constant reminder of what had happened. George understood that moving forward meant leaving the shadows of his past behind. He found a buyer quickly, someone eager to create new memories in a place he was ready to leave. With the proceeds, George invested in a new beginning, choosing a modern apartment in a vibrant area of the city, surrounded by energy and possibility. As he settled into his new environment, George discovered a deeper purpose. The ordeal he had gone through had opened his eyes to the struggles of others facing similar betrayals. He realized that his experience could offer strength and encouragement to those who felt trapped or powerless. Leveraging his resources and experiences, George became an advocate for individuals wronged by betrayal. He volunteered with support groups and legal aid organizations, providing guidance and resources to those navigating their own challenges. His story resonated with many, a testament to the power of resilience and the possibility of redemption. George's journey led him to speaking engagements where he shared his experiences with audiences eager to learn how he had transformed his suffering into empowerment. He spoke honestly and openly, recounting the darkest moments of his life and the road to recovery. His words inspired others to find their own strength, to reclaim their stories, and to forge new paths. In time, George became a sought-after speaker, his message of hope and resilience touching hearts and minds across the nation. He authored a book detailing his journey, a memoir that chronicled the events that had shaped him and the lessons he had learned. The book became a bestseller, further solidifying his role as a beacon of hope for those facing adversity. Throughout it all, George remained humble, focusing on helping others find their paths to healing. He understood that betrayal was a universal experience, one that transcended backgrounds and circumstances. By sharing his story, he hoped to inspire a ripple effect, encouraging others to overcome their challenges and to embrace their potential. In the end, justice was served not only in the courtroom but in the life George had built for himself. He had turned the page on a painful chapter, embracing a future defined not by betrayal, but by hope, empowerment, and the promise of new beginnings.